Welcome to the Transforming Trauma Podcast, a complex trauma podcast through the NARM Training Institute. My name is Sarah Bueno, and I'm so excited to be sharing today's interview with you. Hey, Transforming Trauma listeners. Please join us starting in November for our online NARM Basics training to learn how to transform trauma. This online NARM Basics training is available for professionals working with clients or populations dealing with complex trauma. Now more than ever before, it is essential that we learn how to resolve complex trauma and support post-traumatic growth. NARM provides a relational approach to addressing the current COVID pandemic and tools to support healing in the aftermath of this collective trauma. If you're looking for more advanced training in complex trauma and are working in mental health, healthcare, education, substance abuse recovery, or allied fields, join us for this Level 1 NARM training to become a NARM-informed professional. For more information and to apply, please visit www.narmtraining.com/online-basics. Today is a conversation between Brad and Dani Ishai Behan. So let me tell you a little bit about Dani. He's an East Coast-based writer, researcher, and musician. Of Irish and Judean heritage, Dani's writing focuses on the unique anti-Semitic constructs, post-colonial traumas, and disadvantages faced by Ashkenazi Jews. His main goals are to dismantle these structures, challenge popular anti-Semitic myths about Ashkenazi Jews, and to advocate for their inclusion as an indigenous population in the Middle East. This conversation was really moving, and I know that you're going to enjoy this conversation between Brad and Dani.
All right, Dani, thank you so much for being on with me today. I've been really looking forward to getting a chance to talk with you. You've written a whole bunch of articles or blogs, I guess, that I've been very into reading over the last few months. And so I'm just really excited to get to know you a little bit more, get to know about your work, and then also just see how it relates to the work that I'm interested in around intergenerational trauma, and specifically to my lineage, which is the same lineage that you share of being Jewish. So, I thought we would just start by telling me a little bit about how you got into the writing, into the work that you do, and maybe giving us a little background about who you are and your journey.
I think I grew up a bit differently from most American Jews in that, well, maybe not most, but a good number. I have a white father and a Jewish mother, and I didn't really have an observant upbringing. I was raised with my dad's traditions and my mom's, and basically Jewishness meant to me being like getting gift money on Hanukkah for my childhood. That was pretty much it. And as I grew up, I was curious about my mom's heritage, I guess. And she told me that Jewishness is a religion and that we're of Polish and Russian descent or whatever. And I was like, I just couldn't make sense of it because my mom and her relatives, they looked so Middle Eastern, I guess. And the same was true of a lot of the Jewish kids I went to school with, so that was a source of confusion. I was like, how are we a religion if we don't look like the populations of the countries we come from? And how come anti-Semitism is racial if Jews are a religion? Those were questions I had with me my entire life, and I didn't really get it. And then in 7th grade, I learned about the Holocaust, and I was like, oh my God. I just wanted nothing to do with Jewishness because to me, all it meant at that time, for all I knew, was suffering in some squalid ghetto in Europe for no reason. I had no idea about our origins in Israel, our civilization, our culture, our land. I didn't know about any of that. No one ever told me any of it. So I was part of the punk community since high school, or since before then, and I was originally anti-Zionist because that's what everybody around me was. I absorbed it through osmosis. But over time, I felt something on a cellular level, like people around me, they were obsessed with Israel to a degree that I hadn't seen before, even with the American government or the Iraq or anything like that. It was just weird. It hit me on a cellular level, and it was confusing, and so I wanted more answers. I wanted to know why it was like this. I wanted to know why people were so obsessed with Israel. It can't be doing anything that bad, right? And so I was talking to Israelis, and they told me that most of what they were telling me about Israel was lies, and that we are actually indigenous to the Middle East, that we're turned to our land. We're not actually from Europe or from Morocco or from North America or wherever. We're indigenous to the land of Israel. That's where we come from. And once I realized that, everything just made sense to me. Like why my family looked different, why we were treated differently, why our neighbors were calling us Pakistanis all the time. It all made sense. And I became a proud Jew, like pretty much on the spot, I guess you could say. Because I realized at that point that Jewishness meant more than suffering in some squalid ghetto in Europe for no reason. I was the inheritor of a 3,700-year-old civilization, one that was vibrant before Europeans and others colonized us and took us from our land, and that Israel was our redemption, was our liberation. I was instant Zionist from that point forward.
Wow. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing. I mean, there's just so much there that I resonate with, my own personal experience. And also there's some political and psychological things that I'd love to dive into with you too. I mean, my experience is somewhat similar. People in public would ask me if I was Italian or Greek or even Arabic. And I always hid my Judaism from outside my community.
Yeah, me too.
And,
I used to tell people that like my mom was Mexican or something because
yeah, like that's safer somehow. Yeah, exactly. And I did live in Israel for a period in my 20s, and it kind of raised more questions than gave me answers in a certain way. And I feel like my path of studying trauma has been part of my trying to answer some of these questions for myself and also for oppressed people around the world. And so when I started reading your work, it was touching something that I kind of knew inside, but it's scary to talk about it. I mean, you basically just grouped us as Jews into what's now being referred to as Black and indigenous people of color in the United States. And that's something that I'm not afforded in most circles, right? I mean, I'm looked at as white or white passing. So I guess my question is, back to you and your experiences, you've come out pretty openly about your perspectives and you've been writing openly about it. And I wonder what the response has been just generally, and then the response both kind of from circles on the right and circles on the left in America.
Well, I mean, I didn't really realize that we were non-white people until maybe a few years ago. When I came out as a Zionist, I thought whiteness just meant having white skin or having non-white skin. And my perspective was like, oh, there are Ashkenazi Jews who don't have white skin and they're not white, and there are those who do and that they're white. And same is true of Sephardim and Mizrahim and all that. I didn't think it really had anything to do with geography or experiences in America, which I knew we didn't have the white experience at all. And my friends at the time, who were overwhelmingly anarcho-punks, they rejected me. I was ostracized, and I spent pretty much the next few years by myself, basically living alone in my room with my parents. I think what happened when I realized that Ashkenazi Jews are not white, I took notice of how other minority groups are speaking of themselves, that white passing people are not white, that they're just white passing, and I kind of took that template and I applied it to us. And the response was, there was a lot of, oh my God, this totally makes sense. And then there was a lot of the predictable anger, the anti-Semitism. I wasn't expecting it to really become a mainstream talking point within the Jewish community, but it did. And so I feel like I accomplished something there.
Yeah. Well, you made a huge impact for me over the last year or so. So I appreciate that. And I'm sure other people too. Maybe we could back up, because there's a lot of people that don't, I mean, you and I are intimately understand all these terms, but maybe we should define anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, or maybe just even define Zionism as a starting point.
Zionism just means Jews have the same rights that any other nation has. The right to self-determine in their autochthonous homeland, their land of origin. I mean, these are the same rights that the Japanese have in Japan, that the Chinese have in China, that the French have in France. These are the same rights that the Jew should have in Judea, in Israel. That's what
Yeah.
Zionism is to me. Anti-Zionism is a variant of anti-Semitism. It's not a distinct thing. It's a variant of anti-Semitism in that it seeks to deny Jews equality as a collective. It may not want to send us to the gas chambers or instate Nuremberg laws or anything like that, but it denies us a basic fundamental right that all other collectives, all other ethnic groups would not be denied on the global stage.
I think this was in one of your blogs, but someone was talking about Tibetans and how, most people are not arguing that Tibetans have a right to be living in Tibet and that Chinese have occupied Tibet. But with Israel, that's the argument that somehow we don't have a right, Jews don't have a right to their homeland. And I think that that's part of this kind of confusion, because it feels like when people are, well, clearly when people are anti-Semitic, but even when people are anti-Zionist, there's an erasure of the Jewish identity that I'm just talking because most of my circles are very progressive on the left, and that people would never speak that way about indigenous people in different countries. And yet, for some reason, it's just accepted that we can talk about that as Jews.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the anti-Semitism right there. They're treating us differently. They're treating us as though we don't have the same rights as other peoples, other indigenous peoples.
And then, and then the piece that you added, which I just would love for you to talk more about, is that then not only are we denied that right that other indigenous peoples are given and afforded and supported, but we are also then grouped in with the colonizers, with the oppressors, that we are looked at. I mean, you talk about how, most Jews didn't leave Israel 2,000 years ago by choice. They were driven out either as slaves or in exile. And somehow now, because of the color of our skin for most American Jews, we are then grouped into this white, supremacist, patriarchal system that was the same exact system that did all this intergenerational trauma to us.
Exactly. It's really perverse when you think about it. It's basically bleaching out 2,000 years of hell that we went through in Europe, and all the intergenerational trauma, all the discrimination, all the pain we experienced for being Middle Easterners, for being essentially brown people. And all that is just thrown away. And I think that because of our long presence in Europe, they think that we're actually from there. I think it has a lot to do with the way anti-Semitism has always functioned. I mean, it evolves with the epochs we live in. It evolves like in medieval times when Christianity was the dominant religion. It was framed in a religious, puritanical kind of framework. And then once Christianity fell by the wayside and it became about progress and reason and all that, Jews were framed as backwards and incapable of science. And then in the era of colonialism and racism, we were framed as being brown people, being, Asiatics who didn't belong in Europe. And now the common milieu is social justice and combating white supremacy. Jews are now white. So it's like we're always molded and shaped into the bête noire of the day.
Yeah, and the extra challenge about that is, you talked about it from kind of more the left version, the social justice perspective, but on the right, Jews have never been considered white. That's very clear if you look back into the Nazis in Germany, but even just any kind of white supremacy organization completely annihilates and eradicates the Jews' right to exist and clearly to be white people.
Yeah, that's what I've always said. Like, people who see whiteness as a virtue, as something to aspire to, they don't accept us as white. They never did. And if people think that this is only limited to white supremacists, that it doesn't pervade our institutions, the police force, all that, they're kidding themselves, I think.
Yeah, that was a question I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, because it is confusing about like white privilege, for example, because of course, I can go into a store, not get followed around. I'm generally not getting pulled over for the color of my skin. I mean, those things are for sure not happening. And I would never want to use my own experiences of oppression or my intergenerational experiences of oppression to take that away from Black people in the United States. But at the same time, that privilege that comes with being white passing feels very tenuous and actually kind of scary in a certain way. It doesn't feel like it's a really solid thing for us.
Yeah, there's a difference between white passing, which every minority can have, even African Americans. It's not exclusive to us by any means. There's a difference between white passing and actually being white. Being white passing, in my opinion, is being able to fool society into thinking you're white, until they find out what you actually are. That's how it is with us. When people find out we're Jews, they start treating us differently. Like on the spot.
Yeah.
I've seen it in people's faces. Like when they find out I'm Jews, there's just this scary frown that comes on their faces. It's like, I don't know.
And I think that's part of why I wanted to have you on here, because you speak to the psychology of the trauma too. When you expose yourself as Jewish and see someone's reaction, that's a threat. I mean, that person's reaction is a threat to our existence.
Yeah. And I think another thing people don't understand with this whole Jews not being white thing is that they like to use the Black experience and convert it into a "you must be this tall to enter the non-whites club" sign, and it just doesn't work. No one ever does that with East Asians or with South Asians, and they're not getting followed around in stores, are they? Probably not. But only Jews are expected to meet this impossible standard of having the same experience as Black Americans to be able to identify as non-white. That's just unrealistic. We have our own experiences under white supremacy. We're scapegoated, we're orientalized, we're treated as untrustworthy foreigners, terrorists, bloodthirsty. That's something white people don't have to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, the Jews are what, 0.2%, I think, of the world population and less than 2% of the United States population. And yet there's this belief, and this has been coming out really recently with even from people in the social justice movement, that there's this cabal of Jews that are controlling the planet and controlling political and economic systems and Hollywood and all this stuff. And I don't know if you could talk a little bit about that, but that's a really interesting piece to all this.
I think the whole thing started with Orientalism, Sadian Orientalism. It's couched in the European perception of Jews and Easterners in general as basically mysterious, barbaric foreigners who are probably conspiring against the West.
Yeah, I mean, you focus so much in your writing about this concept of whiteness and talking about how you've done research that's really helped you to align for yourself, but also for your understanding of Jews, that Jews should not be considered or grouped into the whiteness that people are responding to in the United States right now.
I really don't think we should be grouped into whites because, one, we're from the Middle East, and insofar as the Middle East is considered to be, non-white, then we're not white either, because exile in Europe doesn't make us white. It just means we were exiled to Europe, that's all. And if non-whiteness means not benefiting from default status in white majority societies, then no, we're not white under that definition either, because we most certainly don't. People like to compare us to Irish and Italians and East Europeans who at one time weren't white, but it's just not tenable because those populations are indigenous to Europe and we're not. And another thing is that those populations don't really experience discrimination anymore. They're not marginalized. They're accepted as white. Whereas anti-Semitism is still a huge problem in this country. It's an even huger problem in Europe and in South America and other white majority areas. So it doesn't make sense to group any Jews, except maybe recent converts, I guess, under white.
I guess this is where it starts feeling personally a little bit scary for me, is that, I mean, because again, we've talked about how Jews don't belong to this whiteness. And yet it seems like there's this increasing sense on the left that Jews aren't part of their club either because we're not indigenous people of color. And you're basically arguing that we are. I mean, that's your whole point.
Yeah, I think before the 1960s, no one ever questioned our roots in Israel. No one ever saw us as white Europeans. No one ever even, that thought never even entered anyone's heads. But once the paradigm changed and once anti-Zionism became the main mode of anti-Semitism, anti-Semites, they needed to change their argument. They needed to say that we're white Europeans in order to delegitimize us in Israel and to delegitimize us as minorities.
Mm. How does this relate to what's happened in Israel since 1948?
I think at a certain point, the Arab states, they knew they weren't going to destroy Israel through force, and that they needed to destroy it symbolically through propaganda to encourage the world to boycott it. And so they came up with this new narrative, this propaganda that Israel is actually the product of European colonialism, just like South Africa, which they were also boycotting at the time. And the narrative just really took off and was also helped by the fact that Jews in America at the time were I guess, scared to identify as non-white or as Middle Eastern, particularly because of the Holocaust and that wiping out like 1/3 of our entire population.
Yeah, that goes back to what we were talking about before, about how you and I were raised, because it's like for a couple thousand years, as our ancestors were exiled out of Israel, we had to assimilate to all these different cultures. And you and I have talked a lot so far about Ashkenazi Jews, but we haven't talked so much about the other Jews that had to go to other countries, Sephardic, Mizrahi, Ethiopian Jews. But basically, we've had to assimilate. Assimilation was one of the main survival strategies that we always had as Jews. And it's confusing then it's like a trauma response that Jews have to assimilate. And because of the white passing, we have a better shot at assimilating than people that are black or more pronounced people of color. And then at the same time, we don't identify on some deep level as being white. So I don't know what your experience about that is, but just this confusion about being in this kind of middle no man's land.
Yeah, I think with Sephardim and Mizrahim, they mostly lived in countries that there wasn't an explicit racial difference between Jews and Gentiles. I mean, Jews who were living in Arab lands or in Iran or in North Africa, they didn't really stand out the way Jews in Europe did, because the surrounding Gentile population, they were Middle Eastern and brown just like them. Whereas we in Europe, we were basically brown people in a sea of white people. So we stood out hardcore. And we didn't really assimilate at all. We just had to adapt our culture to our new surroundings just to preserve it. It wasn't like we could just order falafel on speed dial or anything.
Yeah, as I was doing some research, I mean, I didn't realize that in the Middle Ages and stuff, a lot of Jews were using all sorts of different various creams and ointments to bleach their skin. There was a lot of men that were trying to reverse their circumcisions. There was women that were trying to straighten their hair, which is similar to what African American women have done. Of course, as we get more modern, we've changed our names. There's been nose jobs. I mean, there's all sorts of ways we've tried to change ourselves to fit into this dominant culture that we never fully belonged to.
Yeah, and skin whitening creams were all very common. I know some family members who have actually used that. I was like, why?
Yeah, I mean, from a trauma perspective, this is really why I was excited to have this conversation with you, because I look at how trauma, not just like PTSD, where someone's in a car accident or blown up in war, but actually how it gets passed down, and the objectification that's been directed at Jews for probably 3,000 plus years now, and the way that we've internalized that objectification towards ourselves. The self-hatred, I think you've talked a little bit about this, but the self-hatred that Jews might experience towards themselves for not belonging.
Yeah, it's really something that all colonized people go through. They internalize the views of their oppressors because after so much oppression for your supposed shortcomings, how could you not? Once you internalize those views, you start trying to cast aside those shortcomings, and you try to be just like those who are oppressing you because you think it'll confer safety. This is why you see skin bleaching creams in South Africa, in South Asia, and among Jews. This is why you see Jews trying to be white, trying to straighten their hair, trying to bleach their skin, trying to flatten their noses, all those things. It's a product of self-hatred, and this is why our parents' generations and our grandparents, they worked very, very hard to reduce Jewishness into a religious identity only because they thought we would be safer that way.
Oh, wow. Okay, that seems important. So that was a survival strategy to create safety by disconnecting from our indigenous roots.
Yes, that's precisely what the idea was. They suppressed it to the point that I wasn't even aware of it until I was already well into college.
Yeah, so then I can imagine that you speaking out about this could be threatening to a lot of Jews.
Yeah, it was. No one in my family agrees with me at all. I mean, when I bring this up with them, they look at me as though I have like 3 heads or something.
And how have you been received generally within the Jewish community?
I would say it varies because some Jews, some Ashkenazi Jews and others are receptive to what I'm trying to do. They understand its importance, and others are bitterly opposed to it for aforementioned reasons. And there are also some non-Ashkenazi Jews who feel that we're stealing their spotlight by identifying as non-white or something, like saying that we're Middle Eastern kind of
like delegitimizes their more clear difference, I guess.
Yeah. I guess there's some ego that's part of it. Like, they want to feel like they're the real deal and that we're just a bunch of LARPers, I guess.
And then there's also the reality that being an oppressed people for many thousands of years, there's been rapes, there's been people that our genetics have changed. And so some Ashkenazi Jews have also, just like some of the modern African Americans were raped as slaves and have a significant percentage of white in their DNA now, Jews have that as well, particularly Ashkenazi Jews.
Yeah, that's something that Mizrahi Jews don't have. But my opinion is that this shouldn't be used against us. We shouldn't be invalidated as Middle Easterners because of the crimes that were committed against us. You know what I'm saying? Especially since, for the most part, there are many, many Ashkenazi Jews who still look Middle Eastern, often, sometimes even more so than some of the Mizrahi Jews I know. Would you really say that, like, Oded Fehr is a white Jew and Charles Saatchi is a Jew of color? That makes no sense.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I grew up in a fairly Jewish community, and so I had friends that looked blonde hair, blue eyes, and then there was friends that were much darker than I was. And again, it just adds to the confusion. I loved how you talked about that before, because you talked about it as a survival strategy of disconnecting from our indigenous nature and making it into some kind of religion. And that's really confusing. It makes someone that's Jewish in America kind of confused because there's a lot of different identities that we're trying to sort through.
Yeah, I grew up with that confusion. I think I still have some of it to a degree because I'm struggling against all these people around me that insist we're just a religion, and I'm one of the only ones I know that is saying that we're actually an indigenous Middle Eastern people, that Ashkenazi Jews are indigenous to the Middle East. I have more support online, of course, like on Twitter, but it's not really that great.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people that are still kind of living under the cloud that maybe you and I were living under when we were younger. And one of the things we talk about with trauma is that there's kind of 2 directions it goes in. One is at the root, which is often mostly unconscious, is like we talked about before, we internalize like the self-hatred or the shame. And so for Jews, it's like we don't have a right to exist. Like if we really show up authentically, we will be annihilated. And that's what we call kind of a shame-based identification. Self-hatred, exactly. And then on top of that, because that's so unbearable, we develop often these pride-based strategies, these pride-based identifications. Some of it, has historically been about assimilation, but lately, with the ability to go back to Israel in the 1940s, it was really with this active fight to exist. Like we were going to actively fight for our right to exist. And, of course, in some ways that can come out as superiority and domination over other people. But if we look at it through the trauma lens, really what it is us fighting very hard, very desperately for our right to exist, just like any other person or community of people.
Yes, we're fighting to reclaim what was stolen from us by colonizers, by colonialism, by exile, by oppression, all of it. We're trying to reclaim what we had before we were banished to Europe. I think that's what Zionism and what my articles are really about. We're trying to unpack all this. We're trying to reverse the damage of all the crimes that have been committed against us and trying to heal ourselves.
It goes into this issue that I would love to talk a little bit more about, is just for particularly those of us that are more progressively minded and working for social justice and healing. How do we navigate this as Jews? Because of course or at least I should speak for myself, of course I believe that the Palestinian people have the right to exist. They have the right to be in their homeland. And I also believe that Jews have the right to exist and be in their homeland. And how do we navigate this without us being the colonizers and not being able to have a voice at the table?
I think another important thing to highlight here is that Jewish indigenous rights should not come at the expense of other people that live there. No one would say that indigenous rights in South America or North America or Africa should come at the expense of the settler populations that live there. Of course not. No honest progressive would actually say that, I think. And another thing is that what's often not talked about is the fact that Arabs became the majority throughout the Middle East, throughout the Levant, throughout Iraq, throughout North Africa, the same way Europeans did in North America. And that's colonialism. And this is true in Israel-Palestine as well. The Palestinians are the remnant of that colonialism. So we also have to reframe the dynamics of this conflict and point out that Palestinians were, from the beginning, the front line of the Arab campaign to restore Arab hegemony throughout the Middle East, including in Israel, to stamp out Jewish self-determination. By cutting off Palestinians from that dynamic, it looks like we're the big guys and they're the little guys, whereas they're actually part of the big guys and we're the little guys.
Yeah, what is it, 6 or 7 million Jews surrounded by, 30 or 40 million Arabs?
Yes, exactly. I think the Arab world at that point, sometime in the 60s, they realized that so long as it remained big, powerful Arab empire against tiny Jewish state, that they would never have the sympathy of the rest of the world. So they needed to alter the power dynamics by making Palestinians into a separate nationality. That was the PLO's goal. They talked about it in interviews. They said that they were creating this Palestinian identity for Arabs within Israel and Arabs who were driven out after Israel's War of Independence as a wedge against Zionism.
And I think there's another important thing, because again, a lot of people are going to be listening to this and, are going to be upset because we're not talking about the Palestinian trauma of being dislocated from where they were living in the 1930s and 40s in their homeland. But I think it's important to talk about how Israel actually came to exist. Most countries were not letting Jews in during the Nazi period. And maybe you could talk a little bit about where Zionism actually came from in that period.
Zionism, early Zionist thinkers like Herzl, they didn't envision any conflict between Jews and Arabs because, the land at the time was very sparsely populated. There was maybe less than 1 million people there, and Jews were already the majority in Jerusalem. And so they didn't really think that there was going to be a problem because, there's plenty of room for Jews to return from Europe. You know what I'm saying? I don't think they really understood at the time just what the Arabs were thinking about Jews at the time, which Mizrahim, I guess, are more familiar with, that Arabs also have a similar view, a similar supersessionist view to the Christians, that they are the true owners of the Israelite mantle now.
Well, yeah, I was asking, because people are going to listen to this conversation and say that we're focusing only on the Jews, but that when Jews came in the late 1940s and occupied Israel, through the charter of the UN and all that stuff, that basically there was a huge trauma for the Arabic people that were living there. And I think it's important just to talk about like how Zionism kind of started. And I think you were doing a good job of talking about how the early Zionists were anticipating that they would come back and live side by side with the Arabs that were living there.
I think the fact that Arabs had dominated the region for so long, they were threatened by Jews coming back and seeking to establish a Jewish commonwealth, even if they were promised equality, that they didn't want. I guess they were kind of afraid of that, I suppose.
Because there was a war that happened right after Israel got independence. I'm not a history buff, but I know that there was Arabic armies that then attacked Israel, attacked the Jews that came back. So just a few years removed from the Holocaust, all of a sudden the Jews had to start fighting to protect what was given to them through the United Nations to return to their homeland.
Yeah, the Arab Empire, the Arab states, they didn't want to give up even 1% of the land they had taken from indigenous peoples. I mean, well, try to imagine like if Native Americans were trying to establish an independent state in part of the United States, like let's say the Lakota were trying to reclaim some of their land under an autonomous Lakota nation state, or the Cherokee or any other indigenous tribe. How do you think like white America will react? They would try to crush the Indians and maintain their hegemony over all of it. And I think that's what was happening in the Middle East. They didn't want to give up any of the power or the land they had, even though they took that land through colonial theft.
Yeah. In some way, you can really look at Zionism as the Jewish liberation movement. Just like, in the 1960s, there was an American Indian movement. They were trying to reclaim land, and they did get crushed by the American government. And in some way, that's what Zionism was really all about. It's about liberating our indigenous homeland for Jews.
That's entirely what it's about for me. It's also about Jews having a place where they won't be persecuted, where we could be our own masters.
Yeah, have self-determination. Yeah. So then this brings us back to my question, because this is something I experience quite a bit, because I do trainings for mental health professionals and social workers on trauma. And obviously, when we start talking about trauma, there's a lot of social justice issues that are embedded in that, particularly in the United States right now, and has been for a long time. But as a person, again, that's like white passing, as a white male, quote unquote, that I've been called numerous times, every time I get grouped into that, I have an internal visceral reaction to that. And I have two kind of directions that I go internally. One is that I get really angry because I don't want people defining my reality, which is part of the whole oppressed trauma that my ancestors have lived through. And part of it is that I feel a lot of shame. Like I feel confused about my own identity.
I feel both of those things at once, more often than not. A third thing I feel is I just kind of want to get rid of all this. I mean, I've had suicidal thoughts over it. Like if I could just end my life and be reborn as something else, that I wouldn't have to deal with this problem anymore. I could just be either white or either non-white. I wouldn't be thrust in between these two worlds. People would acknowledge my reality, or I would have white privilege. I wouldn't lack white privilege and yet be told that I'm white or anything like that. I wouldn't get the worst of both worlds and the benefits of neither.
Wow. Yeah, Dani, that really hit me hard, because I think I can relate to that. And I think the pain in that I'm experiencing, or the grief I'm experiencing as you're talking about that, is up until really recently, and I've been in the trauma world for a long time, but up until recently, I think I personalized it. Like I thought that you talked about suicidal feelings. The pain of these feelings, I thought were about me or about my upbringing with my parents. And I'm opening up to this intergenerational thing, that this is not just about me and my parents. This is something we've carried for thousands of years. And people are still in 2020 not giving us the ability to own our trauma and own our pain.
Or our identity. I mean, every time I'm called a white European, or that my heritage is European, that my culture is European, and that I have pretty much nothing to do with the Middle East outside of religion, if even that, I feel invalidated. I feel like my origins are being erased. I feel like And I get angry when I see Ashkenazi Jews accused of appropriating Middle Eastern culture or whitewashing Middle Eastern roles. I mean, of course it's not whitewashing. We are Middle Eastern. This is who we are. And we're just as entitled to partake in these things as anyone else from the region. And when I see people arguing otherwise, that the crimes that were committed against us, our exile to Europe, our rape by Europeans, robs us of the right to these things, I'm just overcome with so much. I just want a way out. It's unbearable.
Yeah. No, I feel your pain, and I think that you've turned it into a gift for a lot of us because you've been able to start writing about it and put voice to it. And particularly at this time in our society, there's not a lot of people brave enough. I don't feel I've been brave enough at all, like you have, to put yourself out in the front line. Not just with non-Jews, but even with Jews. You're getting attacked, I imagine, from both sides.
Yeah, I've been getting attacked from everybody. Doesn't help that at one point I really tried to deny my Ashkenazi heritage. I tried to present myself as something else because I was just so tired of being called a Khazar, of being called a European, despite everything my family suffered in Europe for being Middle Eastern. It was just so hard for me to deal with. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't get away from it at all. And I just wanted people to accept us as just as valid as those who, quote unquote, never left the Middle East, you know?
Yeah. You told me before we started that you were considering making Aliyah, which is, for those that don't understand what that means, it's going back for Jews to Israel and becoming an Israeli citizen.
Yeah, and there's the thing. Aliyah is called ascent as opposed to descent, which means our descent is from Israel. It's not from Europe. It's not from anywhere else. It's from Israel. We're of Middle Eastern descent.
When you think about that, is that a personal thing for you is that kind of at the end of this journey for you, that you feel like that would be a place that you could find more of your identity? And
well, yes, I do want to see Israel, and I feel like it's ultimately my home, but I also feel like I still have work to do in the West. I have to really change things here so that there won't be any more people like me that are confused about who they are, and that Jews like me are accepted by society, by everybody around the world for what we really are, and that it's taken for granted. You know what I'm saying? I don't want future generations or even today's Ashkenazi Jews to feel like their Middle Eastern roots or their Israelite roots, that their civilization, their history are not real, that they're not valid, that they're not as valid as those who more recently lived in the Middle East. Of course, we didn't recently live there. We were exiled. We were taken to Europe as slaves. That's how else do I put this? I mean, well, put it this way. An immigrant who recently arrived from Lebanon is no more or less valid than an Ashkenazi Jew who arrived here via Europe. You know what I'm saying? Because both are Middle Eastern. One was just exiled to Europe for generations, and the other was not. I would say that the Lebanese person is privileged in that manner, because
privileged in
the sense that they didn't have to endure centuries of captivity and exile in Europe. That their Middle Eastern descent, roots, identity, race, whatever you want to call it, is basically accepted, taken for granted, whereas ours is not. It's denied, like, all the time.
Yeah, and I think you just named, again, we talked about this earlier, but this piece, you used the word captivity in Europe. And see, that's the thing I think that gets whitewashed, I guess is a good word for it, is that we and you challenged me a little bit earlier. I used the word assimilation, but that's not really the right word. The right word is that we were in captivity originally.
Yeah.
And just like the Africans were brought over in captivity. So you wouldn't really say now that they're assimilating. You'd say that they're still trying to deal with the fact that they were dislocated from their homeland and brought through captivity, through domination and oppression. And now they're just supposed to fend for themselves in a society that largely doesn't want them and doesn't accept them as being true Americans. And I think that is a place that Jews and Blacks historically have been able to align, at least in America, around.
Yes, we're both peoples that were dislocated from our homelands and we were forced to eke out a survival and preserve our identities in foreign lands. I think that's our main commonality right there.
Yeah. Well, when I went to Israel and I lived there for a little bit period of time in my 20s, this is a little bit of a cliche for Jews, but there is something real about this. There's an embodied sense when you land in Israel that you're home. And people talk about crying when they get off the plane, and there's a certain security or safety, even though there's war and chaos all around. There's something about being with your people on your land that goes very, very deep historically.
Yes, I can imagine how impactful that is. I've dreamed of the day I would set foot in Israel and just trying to imagine what it would feel like. I mean, especially with the perspective I have now. This would be my homecoming.
Yeah. Well, I have two kind of final questions. The first is just thinking about Israel itself and the fact that, there are these real difficulties, and I don't want to get too into the political side of it because we're today mostly focusing just on the Jewish side of it. But any thoughts about how we can move towards some kind of greater peace in Israel with the Palestinians and with the Arabs around?
Well, I mean, I used to think that compromising would, bring the Palestinians back to the table, but I'm not convinced of that anymore. I think they need to be forced to accept that we're not going anywhere, and that's their dream of destroying Israel is never going to come, especially with, more and more Arab countries recognizing Israel. Their house of cards is crumbling down now, I mean, for lack of a better metaphor.
So it basically starts with the Palestinians being able to recognize that Jews have a right to exist in their homeland.
Yes, they need to accept reality here. This is our land. We're indigenous here. They have a right to live here, and they have a right to have a state. Of course they do, but they don't have the right to take ours away, take our rights, our identity away. That's not going to happen.
And then the second is kind of more specific to where you and I live. It's just in United States. And this is a little bit more of a personal question for me. If you have any advice for me, is just, I'm a teacher, and so I'm kind of a leader in my community, and I'm out there very publicly. I'm very exposed. And I notice that I do hide myself, my true identity a lot when I'm teaching. And this is from very progressive communities. This is not from the right wing, although I've worked in those communities in the past. But I don't know if you have any thoughts or suggestions about just how I can continue to embody more of this and weather some of the attacks that are coming from people that don't identify Jews as being part of the marginalized communities that social justice is focusing on.
I think the only thing we can do is to keep pushing back against these narratives, because they're not going to go away. I mean, if we just continue doing what our parents and grandparents did and just going along with it and identifying as white and saying that and lying and saying that our descent is European, then of course nothing's going to change, because we're letting them keep these narratives about us. We have to challenge them. We need to do so more visibly and more consistently and more forcefully.
Yeah. Which is what you've been modeling for me in your writing, and I really appreciate it. And I wonder if you wanted to tell folks who are listening where they can find your work.
My work is at Times of Israel, mostly under the name Dani Ishai Behan. Actually, all of them are under the name Dani Ishai Behan.
We'll put it in the show notes to make sure that people can link to it directly.
Okay.
Well, Dani, I've been so excited to talk with you since I found your work. I don't know, whenever that was, months ago. I really appreciate all you're doing. I really thank you for sharing some of your pain as well, because that's pain that I feel myself and have felt for a long time. And I appreciate us being able to share that together a little bit here. And I wish you all the best with the work you're doing. And if you end up going to visit or move to Israel, let me know, be in touch.
Okay.
Yeah, and thanks for everything. So take care.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. If you want to learn more, you can check out the show notes or visit us at www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Please join us for our online NARM training in learning how to transform trauma. This online NARM basics training is available for professionals working with clients or populations dealing with complex trauma. Join us for this Level 1 NARM training to become a NARM-informed professional. For more information and to apply, please visit at www.narmtraining.com/online-basics. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We really look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.